Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today for a truly important conversation about the gun violence epidemic in America today. This is the second roundtable on gun violence that the Oversight Committee Democrats have held this Congress. I want to thank my colleagues who are en route from Florida, Congressman Maxwell and Congressman Jared Moskowitz, for their involvement and their passionate commitment to ending gun violence. I want to recognize my colleagues who are here now, beginning with our distinguished colleague from Michigan, Rashida Tlaib, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's the delegate from the District of Columbia, and we've been joined also by our friend Lucy McBath from Florida. 2 weeks ago, in the immediate wake of the horrific school shooting in Winder, Georgia, my Democratic colleagues and I urged Chairman Comer to immediately convene a hearing on the epidemic of gun violence that is ravaging America. And our pleas for action have been met with complete and total silence from Chairman Comer and from the Republican majority. So far in 2024, there have been more than 400 mass shootings across the country, defined as shootings that kill or injure at least 4 people, not including the shooter himself. Yet this Congress, the majority has refused to hold a single hearing about any mass shooting, with a single exception, when one of the intended victims in the mass shooting was Donald Trump. The security of the former president and all presidential candidates is obviously critical in our society, and our bipartisan hearing spurred the bipartisan investigation into the mass shooting and assassination attempt of the former president. But what about the security of students and teachers in Georgia? What about the safety of children in Uvalde, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee? What about the people shopping in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, or a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, or worshipers at the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, or at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania? We say that the lives of our children and our loved ones count just as much, and cry out for serious congressional investigation and action. Every person in America deserves to live a life free from AR-15 attacks and gun violence, not just presidential candidates. In the face of stony-faced Republican refusal to do anything to improve public safety, we Democrats on the Oversight Committee have convened this roundtable to lift up the voices of people in communities all across America still living through America's gun violence epidemic. We hope to force our colleagues to acknowledge the staggering human, financial, medical, educational, and social costs of their decision simply to tolerate out-of-control gun violence in our country as a fact of life. Since the beginning of this Congress, there have been more than 1,000 American mass shootings that have claimed more than 1,000 lives and injured more than 4,300 people. And we have had 0 hearings on the general problem of gun violence. And these mass shootings represent just 1% of all the firearm violence taking place in our country. The gruesome reality is that firearms are the leading killer of children and teens in America, beating out car accidents, childhood disease, and even cancer. In 2022, we lost an average of 7 young people every single day from gun violence in our country. And while school shootings may account for only a small fraction of total gun violence, the continued attacks on our elementary and middle schools and high schools spread terror throughout our communities and are fundamentally changing the character of childhood in our society. Schools should be havens of intellectual and emotional growth, where our kids fall in love with learning and acquire the skills needed to become responsible adults and citizens. With rampant and random gun violence afflicting every state in the union, schools have instead become a locus of fear and anxiety for a so-called lockdown generation, where active shooter drills, random bloodshed, and community heartbreak have come to define the lives of hundreds of thousands of young Americans and their families. Even beyond the terrifying violence and gore that are standard fare on TV, there is far more to the picture than meets the eye. In countless communities, long after the TV cameras have left and the country's attention has shifted to the next bloody spectacle, the nightmare has just begun for parents, brothers and sisters, grandparents, and other grieving family members, bereaved loved ones, and classmates and teachers and friends left behind trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. In the months and years after a mass shooting, young people themselves injured or wounded in the attack experience continuing pain, trauma, fear, and disorientation, and struggle to hang on to what's left of their lives. Studies show that these victims are less likely to graduate from high school, to obtain a college degree, or even to find their place in the labor market compared to young people who have not lived so directly through the horrors of gun violence. In the year after getting shot and enduring a firearm injury, kids will experience not only violent interruption of their academic, athletic, extracurricular, and social lives, but substantial increases in psychiatric disorders and higher rates of alcohol and substance abuse. The parents, siblings, and family of a wounded gun violence survivor also experience a marked increase in psychiatric disorders themselves and are 75% more likely to seek mental health care than other people in the population. And that does not fully explain the fear and trauma these survivors experience every single day. The path to recovery is long and winding, and many will never fully recover. There's also an economic cost to our uniquely American gun violence epidemic, one that's borne by the schools themselves and surrounding communities that experience this violence. Research shows that gun violence costs the United States more than $550 billion every year, more than $500 billion a year that the gun dealers and the firearm manufacturers don't pay for. That's the equivalent of about 2.6% of our nation's GDP. Without meaningful common sense gun reform, Americans are paying more every year in taxes to pay for massive medical and hospital emergency room and long-term care costs, expensive school resources for security, building reinforcements and cleanup costs, huge criminal justice and first responder costs, just to name a few. Our panelists today will share their stories about what it means to live with the staggering and mostly invisible consequences of gun violence and the heartbreaking obstacles that they have encountered as they and their communities and families try to recover some semblance of normal life. They will share the experience with the overwhelming and enduring medical and psychiatric costs of a mass shooting and the psychological, emotional, educational, and financial complications of trying to address so much trauma, grief, and fear in their communities in the wake of gun violence. In addition to our other panelists, we have invited here today 3 principals from public schools that have suffered an episode of gun violence, and I want to thank them for really bringing this whole category of unexamined reality to my attention. It is critical for Americans to hear their stories, to understand that this is not over when they turn the TV cameras off, but this is a long-term struggle that takes place. They are going to tell us about the recovery process, what is needed to support the next school and community that suffers a shooting, what tips that they have. Anyone who thinks that a school community can suffer a mass AR-15 attack on Friday and then just dust themselves off over the weekend and be back in action on Monday is about to get an education into the real facts of life in America from the people who have dealt with gun violence and all of the subsequent effects of it. We're told that gun violence is just a fact of life in America. We're invited to believe nothing can be done about it. C'est la vie. Gun violence is before a fact of life, it's a fact of death in America, the leading cause of death for children and teenagers. But as you're about to see, it's indeed a fact of life too, for all of the injured, the wounded, the traumatized, and the broken-hearted people who struggle to hang on and survive in the wake of such a disaster. We, on the Democratic side, refuse to accept gun violence as an inevitable, melancholy fact of life or death in America. We must build a better and more peaceful nation for our children and for this lockdown generation. And I want to thank all of our panelists for coming today from across the country to be with us to bear witness to this extremely important topic. I'd like to introduce our panelists here now. First, we're going to hear from three principals who are integral parts of the National Association of Secondary School Principals Principal Recovery Network, a nationwide network of current and former school leaders who have themselves directly experienced gun violence and work to provide support to their colleagues and the broader principal community. Frank DeAngelis is a founder of the Principal Recovery Network and the former principal of Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, where he served in different positions for over 35 years. Patricia Greer is also a founding member of the Principal Recovery Network. She currently serves as the director of the Resource Center for the Kentucky Center for School Safety. She served as the principal of Marshall County High School in Benton, Kentucky from 2017 to 2020. Greg Johnson is a founding member and facilitator of the Principal Recovery Network. He served as principal of West Liberty Salem High School in West Liberty, Ohio since 2005. Then we will hear from Melissa Alexander, a parent and an advocate. She has dedicated her passionate voice to firearm safety after her child narrowly survived a shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville, Tennessee in 2023. We will then hear from Sarah Bird Sharps, the Senior Director of Research at Everytown for Gun Safety and her research on the economic costs of gun violence. Then we will hear from Ruquan Brown, a teacher at Hart Middle School in Washington, D.C. Ruquan is a gun violence survivor and prevention advocate and a member of the board of directors for March for Our Lives. And our final panelist is Dr. Joseph Sakharin. Dr. Sakharin holds a variety of positions at Johns Hopkins Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland, including Executive Vice Chair of Surgery and Director of Clinical Operations. He also serves as the board chair and Chief Medical Officer at the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. We are eager to hear from all of them. We are asking the panelists to limit their opening remarks to no more than 5 minutes. We will have a bunch of questions for all of you, and we hope to have a very significant and meaningful dialogue as we move forward. And with that, Mr. DeAngelis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for the purposes of offering your opening statement.
Good afternoon, honorable members of the committee, and thank you for inviting me here today. I would like to thank Ranking Member Raskin for the invitation to participate in this important discussion on preventing gun violence in our American communities, and for his attention to the urgent need to protect our K-12 schools and to aid the recovery for those who have unfortunately already suffered tragic shootings. I appreciate your leadership on gun violence prevention and recovery, and I appreciate your ongoing support for all the schools that need assistance in the wake of violence and tragedy. As he stated, my name is Frank DeAngelis, and I'm the retired principal of Columbine High School. I had been a part of Columbine for 45 years. I was a staff member starting my career in 1979 as a social studies teacher, head baseball, assistant football, dean of students, assistant principal, and principal before becoming principal in 1996. After our tragedy in 1999, I have often been called upon to speak about recovery after a school shooting and have assisted as a consultant after several other violent school events. I was selected as the Colorado High School Principal of the Year and was a finalist, one of the 3 finalists for Principal of the Year. I retired in 2014 after 35 years at Columbine and presently serving as a consultant for safety and emergency management for Jeffco School District in Colorado and a senior advisor for Safe and Sound Schools, which was started by Michelle Gay, the mother of Joey that was killed at Sandy Hook. I am one of the founding members of the Principal Recovery Network and continue to speak on school violence and recovery across the United States, Canada, and Europe. My Uncle Vito once told me, choose a job you love and you never have to work a day in your life. Love what you do and do what you love. And I chose a job I loved even after I experienced one of the worst days of my life. On April 20th, 1999, I was getting ready to finish my 20th year at Columbine, my 3rd year as principal. That day would change my life forever. It's a day in which the lives of the members of our society changed forever. A day in which the world witnessed our vulnerability. A day in which the value for human life was destroyed and peace was compromised. A day that I became a member of a club that no one wanted to join. I was sitting in my office getting ready to go meet with the new teacher And as a result, I was late to cafeteria duty, and I was one of the few high school principals that I loved cafeteria duty because I got to be with my kids. Kiki Leba, who is still working at the school to this day, finally walked in my office at about 11 a.m., and I'm getting ready to welcome to the Columbine family. But before we can finish, my secretary ran into my office and said, "Frank, there had been a report of gunfire." And I could not believe this was happening. I can count on two hands the number of fistfights we had in my 20 years at Columbine. As I ran out of my office, my worst nightmare became a reality. I saw a gunman coming down the hallway with the hat turned backwards, cut off T-shirt, and the size of the gun, the barrel of the gun looked about the size of the cannon. And everything seemed to slow down, and I started wondering what it was going to feel like to have a bullet pierce my body. I thought about my family, wondering if I would ever see them again. And did I tell them that I loved them when I left for school that morning? In an instant, I sprinted towards the gunman, and I can't tell you the number of times someone said, "Why would you sprint towards a gunman?" One reason and one reason only. My kids were in trouble. I had about 25 girls that were coming out of the locker room to go to a physical education class. In 1999, the only drills we did were fire drills. But I knew if I got the girls into the hallway, into the gymnasium, we would be able to hide them safe until we were able to get outside. Everything was going as planned until I pulled on the gymnasium door, and it was locked. The gunman is coming around the corner. Shots are being fired. The girls started saying, "Mr. D, Papa D, please save us." They started praying. I reached into my pocket, and I had 30 keys on a key ring. And the first key I stuck in the door, I'd open it on the first try, or I wouldn't be sitting here. It was a couple of years ago. A young lady, Katie, she was one of the girls that was with me that day. She was at a softball game for Columbine High School. They were in state championship. It got very emotional, and she held me, and we were crying, and all of a sudden she spun me around, and she said, "Mr. D, I am so glad you found that key, because if you didn't, my daughter wouldn't be playing right field." I had very little to do in finding the key that day. I have been told after every shooting I could not believe it happened here. And if you would have asked me 25 years ago, could a Columbine happen at Columbine, I would have said no. You just joined a club in which no one wants to be a member. 12 of my beloved students lost their life, along with my best friend and mentor, Dave Sanders, who was a hero that day and gave the ultimate sacrifice, his life. I did not want my beloved 13 to die in vain, and I committed to do whatever I could to stop these senseless acts of violence. Unfortunately, the tragedies continue to happen. I remember receiving a phone call shortly after our tragedy from Bill Bond, the former principal at Heath High School in Paducah, Kentucky, where a school shooting occurred in December of 1997. He said to me, "Frank, you don't know what you need yet, but here's my number." I was hoping I would never have to make that call, but unfortunately I've made it many times the past 25 years. In 2018, I received a phone call from Greg Waples at NASSP, and he asked me if I would be interested in forming the Principals Recovery Network, or PRN. The PRN is made up of 21 current and former principals who, like me, suffered a shooting in their school or assumed leadership immediately after the shooting to lead the long road to recovery. The PRN includes principals of Sandy Hook, Stoneman Douglas, Marshall, Chardon, Aztec, but it also includes principals whose tragedy didn't grab the attention, nonstop national media for days or weeks. Forest, Wake Liberty, Salem, Harrisburg, Perry Hall. These are just some of the PRN member shot schools that have not ring in your mind as acutely as Columbine and other schools where the national attention was given. But they represent the hundreds of school shootings that have taken place over the past few decades, and every one of them leaves an intense amount of trauma in our entire school and community. Several members were themselves shot in their tragedy. Still, despite the trauma, this heroic group of leaders reaches out to every single school that suffers a shooting and offer advice, guidance, and support to the principal and the district on the best practices for recovery. We work closely with the Department of Education to coordinate outreach efforts, as well with the Department of Homeland Security, CISA agency, to advise on their excellent support in school safety products and resources. We have produced the Principal Recovery Guide that we released in 2022 at the Columbine Memorial in Littleton, Colorado. The guide is a collection of our living experience to serve as a counselor for school leaders facing the unimaginable. There is no course in our principals certification programs that instructs us how to navigate the aftermath of a mass shooting, so we were forced to make our own. Sadly, the PRN's work to care for and support our fellow educators and staff and students has become devastatingly frequent in recent years. With so many shootings, there is simply not enough state or federal recovery funding and resources to go ahead for all of these shattered schools. If safety in school is not prioritized, how will educators remain in the profession, especially during growing nationwide educator shortage crisis? How will students focus on learning? I was asked after the Columbine shooting, what are you going to do? And my response is, what are we going to do? These are all of our kids, and one more death is one too many. Each morning, before my feet hit the ground, when I get out of bed, I recite the names of my beloved 13. Cassie Bernal, Stephen Curnow, Corey DePuter, Kelly Fleming, Matt Kechter, Daniel Mauser, Danny Rohrbaugh, Dave Sanders, Rachel Scott, Isaiah Scholes, John Tomlin, Lauren Townsend, Kyle Velasquez. They're the reason that I do what I'm doing. And it was 25 years ago, I had the task of going to 13 memorial services. And when I went to those services, I did not see a Democratic sticker on a casket. I did not see a Republican sticker on a casket. I did not see a blue or red casket. We need to come together because they're all of our kids, and another death is one too many. Thank you for allowing me to share my comments.
Thank you, Mr. DeAngelis, for your very moving remarks and for your activism with the Principals Recovery Network, and thank you for approaching me in the first place and telling me about the group you have. Ms. Greer, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, honorable members of the committee. I am Patricia Greer, Resource Center Director for the Kentucky Center for School Safety and former principal of Marshall County High School. I want to thank Ranking Member Jamie Raskin and the House Government Oversight Accountability Committee members for this invitation to discuss urgent actions Congress can take to prevent and heal from gun violence in our schools, as well as my Congressman James Comer for his support of Kentucky schools and for the support he gave me personally after the shooting tragedy my community and I suffered and continue to suffer. On January 23, 2018, Marshall experienced a tragic shooting that forever changed our community. A student entered our school with a handgun and opened fire in a common area where hundreds of students were gathered. 2 students were killed and 20 were injured physically. My heart breaks for these victims, but the trauma that day extends far beyond those physically injured. Our entire community was wounded, and recovery is still ongoing 6 years later with no end in sight. This experience is not unique to Marshall County. It's a reality faced by hundreds of school communities across the nation. According to the Washington Post, there have been 417 school shootings since the Columbine tragedy, affecting over 383,000 these incidents. During my time working with schools after they experienced shooting as part of the Principal Recovery Network, I've seen firsthand the devastating impact of school violence and the long road to recovery for these communities. Today, I'm here to advocate for increased funding and support for our schools, focusing on 3 critical areas: Title II and IV, and ESSA funding to ensure there are talented professionals supporting our students' education and well-being, and Project SERVE grants to help schools like mine through the unending road to recovery. Teachers are considering leaving the profession in record numbers, feeling unprepared for the complex challenges they face daily, and fewer are lining up to take their place. Teaching has evolved far beyond traditional academics, now encompassing critical areas like social emotional learning and mental health support. Title II Part A funding is essential for providing the professional development our educators desperately need to meet these challenges and remain in the profession to show up for our students in times of need. Similarly, our nation is facing a critical shortage of mental health resources, and this crisis is acutely felt in our schools and communities. Many areas lack qualified counselors to help in the aftermath of traumatic events, and community mental health providers often have long wait lists. Our schools, which are on the front lines of identifying and addressing student mental health needs, are overwhelmed and under-resourced. Schools are uniquely positioned to provide mental health support, but they need our help to meet the growing demand. Title IV Part A funds play a crucial role in expanding school-based mental health services, often being used to hire school counselors and mental health professionals. By increasing this annual funding to at least $1.48 billion, we can give more students access to vital support they desperately need. The American School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 250 students per counselor, but most schools fall far short of this goal. The national average is actually 385 students to one school counselor for the 22-23 school year. This limits counselors' ability to provide direct student services and leaves many children without the support they need. More funding is urgently needed to hire additional counselors and mental health staff to meet this growing crisis. The bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022 was a big step in the right direction, but the scale of the mental health crisis demands further action. I urge Congress to significantly increase Title IV funding to expand access to school-based mental health services, reduce the counselor-to-student ratios, and provide continuative care of students as they transition out of the K-12 setting. Project SERVE grants have also been a lifeline for schools like Marshall. These grants allowed us to hire 2 mental health counselors who became integral to our recovery process. These mental health counselors were able to start seeing a caseload of students who needed mental health services. Another facet of our recovery was the social-emotional lessons that these mental health providers were able to provide to our teachers. The teachers were then able to use these scripts to provide lessons to our entire student body. Increasing Project SERVE funding from $5 million to at least $25 million annually would ensure more schools have access to these crucial resources in times of crisis. The impact of school violence extends far beyond the day of the tragedy. Recovery is an ongoing process that requires sustained support and resources. By increasing funding for Project SERVE to $25 million, Title II to $2.4 billion, and Title IV to $1.48 billion, we can provide schools with the resources they need to prevent tragedies and support students through trauma. I urge you to consider these increases as Congress continues to debate fiscal year 2025 appropriations. Our students' safety and well-being depends on your decisions. Thank you for your time and considerations.
Ms. Greer, thank you for your wonderful remarks. And now, Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, honorable members of the committee, and thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Greg Johnson. I'm in my 20th year as the proud principal of West Liberty-Salem High School. We are a small public rural school in Ohio. Unless you closely follow track or cross country in Ohio, you've probably never heard of my school, but there was one day that we briefly made the national news. On January 20th, 2017, we experienced a school shooting. One student was critically injured, but thankfully no one was killed. In many cases, that's the end of the news story. The injured student made a miraculous recovery, and he actually returned to school the following month. We were blessed with a local community, as well as many surrounding communities, that wrapped their arms around us in love and support. And on the surface, everything pointed to a quick and healthy recovery. But looks can be deceiving. What I didn't see in those early weeks and months after the shooting was the traumatic impact that it had on our students. Hundreds of students heard the piercing shotgun blasts, and those same hundreds barricaded the doors of their classrooms before they evacuated and ran through muddy ditches and across fields in search of safety. Many were traumatized, though almost all tried their very best to hide it by putting on a mask of strength and normalcy. Our students suffered in silence. In the aftermath, we learned valuable lessons about the importance of immediate and sustained support for our school community. Project SERVE funding was crucial in our recovery process. As I found out, a fatality is not a requirement for trauma to occur. And Project SERVE can be a funding lifeline for schools that experience all kinds of traumatic events, including a non-fatal shooting like the one that occurred at my school. It allowed us to hire a school resource officer and a part-time mental health clinician, both who have become integral parts of our school community after our students' pain bubbled to the surface. Now everyone has a relationship with our SRO. He's Deputy J. He's an assistant football coach. He's reading books in kindergarten and first grade classrooms. He's hanging out with kids in the lunchroom. The whole time he's doing that in uniform, projecting a sense of safety throughout the school. And when my kids have trouble sleeping, when they saw their grades slipping, when they had troubling thoughts, Mrs. Lichty was right there alongside our high school counselor, Mrs. Smith, to help them through it. However, it's important to understand that recovery from a school shooting often takes years, not months. The current typical period of Project SERVE funding is often not enough. As the number of schools affected by shootings continue to rise, Congress must increase these grants to at least $25 million to reach the rising number of schools in need and to give them the support that they need. In our case, after those Project SERVE funds ran out, we had to find other ways of funding to maintain those essential employees that we added. This is where Title II and Title IV funds can play a crucial role. As a leader of a small rural school, we often lack the local funds and the talent pool to recruit, train, and retain the excellent teachers and mental health professionals that we need. Title II can help principals like me keep the staff our students love and give them new skills to better take on the mental health responsibilities that have become integral to their role of educators around our country. But for our students who need the most help, it is especially difficult to find them the proper care to ensure their well-being. When you have a student who's suicidal, you don't want to see them put on a 2-week waiting list. Title IV funds can help ensure that students have access to talented mental health professionals who they trust within their own school. And both these funds can help me pay for the services that my SRO and my counselor provide for the long term without sacrificing other programming. Looking forward, I also know the proposed Plan for School Safety Act could be a game changer for schools across the country. In Ohio, we benefit from the Ohio School Safety Center, which provides invaluable resources and training. I've been personally involved with the center, and my daughter is even a part of the Student Safety Council. Their combination of proven practices with local context is essential in both preventing and recovering from school shootings. The PLAN Act would allow centers like mine to reach more schools and meet their unique needs. As I think about how many school shootings have occurred just this month at Appalachia, Joppatown, Omaha West, and more, my heart breaks. My heart breaks for the friends and families of those victims who were killed, Mason, Christian, Richard, Christina, and Warren, as well as all those victims who were injured in these shootings. But my heart also breaks for the thousands deeply impacted by these shootings. As you return to federal budget negotiations, I hope you remember these resources that can make a real difference in preventing future tragedies and supporting long-term recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I will now recognize Melissa Alexander for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin and honorable members of the committee. Many of you whom I recognize and thank for your work on this issue. My name is Melissa Alexander. I'm a mother of a mass shooting survivor. On March 27, 2023, our lives were forever changed. A shooter armed with a semi-automatic high-capacity rifle entered my 9-year-old son's elementary school in Nashville, Tennessee. They wreaked havoc on the school, firing 152 rounds, and murdered 3 children and 3 adults. I vividly remember that morning when I got the phone call from my son. His name is Ozzy. He was frantically begging for me to come save him. This is how I learned of the shooting. I told him, "I love you, baby." And I wanted him to be quiet so he would be safe. I drove as fast as I could to reach him, and I remembered letting out a guttural scream in helplessness, not knowing if those would be our last words. My son survived, and on that day he grew up. He saw unimaginable things no child should ever see. He prepared to die. According to the Washington Post, there have been 383,000 children like my son since Columbine that have experienced some form of gun violence at school. Yet we don't hear about survivors in the media. A mass shooting is something you do not get over. Places, sounds, smells, fire alarms, remembering those lost become daily reminders of something that should not have ever been. The stress on your family becomes unbearable at times. I remember the inability to eat, to sleep, to focus, to work in the immediate aftermath. Simple decisions like picking out something to wear became impossible. I am just one example of many. Mental and physical health issues, loss of learning, loss of income, isolation, depression, and divorce are just a few examples of how a mass shooting can impact a community of survivors. The ongoing effects send ripples throughout the greater community. Parents are fearful to send their kids to school. Other children are worried about if they could be next. And there's significant costs, as Congressman Raskin mentioned, to repair, rebuild, clean up, or tear down physical structures. I'm here to tell you that surviving isn't the goal. We want to prevent these tragedies in the first place. As a gun owner and as a Republican, I have spent the last year and a half working with fellow advocates on both sides of the aisle on the need for changes to our gun laws. This is not a partisan issue. In a very red state like Tennessee, time and time again, we've seen 75% or more of constituents support stronger measures on firearm safety. 75% in poll after poll. Many lawmakers will cite this as a mental health issue. I don't disagree. However, it's also an access issue. As a gun owner, I firmly believe we can make real change to our gun laws that are in line with the Second Amendment. If the events of March 27th teaches anything, or any of these events mentioned today, it is that we must do everything we can under the law to keep firearms and weapons of war out of the hands of unstable people who intend to commit great harm. Whether you've lost a child, are a survivor, a sibling, a parent, a teacher, or just sitting here listening to us today, we are all affected by these mass shootings, every single one of us. We cannot function as a society at this level of trauma. It does not have to be this way. For the future of our children, for the future of our great nation, this has to change. We must take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for your activism and your eloquence on the issue. I recognize now Sarah Bird Sharps for her 5 minutes of testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ranking Member Raskin and members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you to address a topic that's rarely part of the conversation on gun violence in this country, the economic and financial cost of this crisis. My name is Sarah Bird Sharps. I'm the Senior Director of Research at Everytown for Gun Safety Support Fund. The tragic school shootings we're hearing about today and the 114 incidents of shootings on school grounds in the last school year alone are leaving in their wake grieving families, survivors scarred by tragedy, students afraid to go to school, and parents afraid to send them, and a nation that's truly traumatized for fear of the next incident. Without a doubt, this human cost of gun violence is the most devastating. No dollar amount could ever convey this. But examining the economic consequences of gun violence is essential as well for understanding just how extensive and expensive this crisis is. I want to look at the cost of one shooting, the one at Marshall County High School in Benton, Kentucky. On that January 2018 day, 2 students were shot and killed, and another 14 were shot and wounded. We estimate that the economic consequences of that one incident alone are $34 million. This includes medical bills, ambulances, police investigations, criminal justice costs, work lost to employers who lost employees or who were absent, and quality of life lost to gun violence for victims and their immediate families. To garner an understanding of all these costs, Everytown worked for over a year with health economist Dr. Ted Miller, who's the leading researcher costing injuries of all kinds for the CDC and for others. And the data in these calculations comes from multiple federal, state, and academic sources, including the CDC, HHS, state hospital records, extensive peer-reviewed research of costs of mental health services, of police investigations, incarceration, prescriptions, and more. In this study, we found that the unrelenting epidemic of gun violence has an economic consequence to our nation, as Member Raskin said, and that comes from our study, of $557 billion annually, year after year. This represents the lifetime costs associated with all the gun deaths and non-fatal injuries in 1 year, starting at the scene of a shooting and continuing on to the longer-term impacts that people have been talking about on survivors, on families, on employers, and on taxpayers. But this over $500 billion is, in fact, a really conservative estimate, right? If you talk to any of these principals, a mayor, a doctor in a town that experiences a shooting, they can produce a long list of costs far beyond the immediate items that we're counting. Costs for completely redoing schools and for mounting costs for school security systems, costs to neighborhood businesses, and the larger reverberations on the community trauma to all of us. And the government share of these costs is $12 billion each year. Government costs paid for by taxpayers fall in 6 areas. There's Medicare, Medicaid, SSI, there's taxpayer-funded ambulances, police response, and the largest cost for courts and criminal justice. To put that into perspective, that adds up to nearly $35 million a day, money that could instead fund positive, productive investments, right? Excellent schools, high-quality job training programs, efficient public transportation, all kinds of expenditures that could help us build healthier, safer, more sustainable communities. As taxpayers, we all pay for the enormous costs associated with this violence. However, in states with stronger gun laws and local violence intervention programs and fewer gun injuries and fatalities, the economic toll is far less. So, for example, Mississippi has long been challenged by high levels of gun violence, and it has some of the weakest gun laws in the country. The annual toll of gun violence, $9.9 billion a year, is an incredibly high burden for Mississippians. On the other hand, in Massachusetts, that has the lowest rate of gun deaths in the country and some of the strongest laws, the annual cost is $3.5 billion. Still a lot, but a third of Mississippi, allowing the state and its residents to allocate far more dollars to beneficial investments. Our research clearly shows we're spending precious funds on an epidemic that brings nothing of benefit and plenty of heartbreak and shattered lives. We place ourselves at a severe economic disadvantage in the globally competitive economy with these enormous outlays. With 120 lives taken from guns and $1.5 billion in costs and loss every day, there's no time to waste. Thank you again for inviting me to participate in this roundtable, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sarah Bird-Sharps, for that very powerful testimony and insight as to what the economic costs of out-of-control gun violence are in our society. I'm recognizing now Raquan Brown for his 5 minutes of testimony.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. Good afternoon to the communities that I represent, to the people that are watching, to the souls that are listening. This is always really hard to do, whether it's at a council level here in D.C. or on TikTok, Instagram, or at a rally with March, or on a corner in my community in D.C. and Southeast or in Uptown. It never gets easier, and I think that's because I shouldn't have to be having this conversation. I'm 22 years old. I just graduated from Harvard College studying Black history. I've had to be an activist since I was 12 years old because issues like these, gun violence, and a lack of every other resource that the most vulnerable people, young people, and other marginalized groups need, just generationally in this country, have not had. But let's have a very important conversation. I'm a 7th grade social studies teacher. I studied Black history, so that means I know the fabric of this country. Around 1600, gun violence maybe was introduced to this country. Maybe it was 200 years before that, but let's say 1600. We'll give America the benefit of the doubt. 1600, gun violence was introduced to this country, and millions of people were kidnapped from the western coast of Africa and brought to cities like this one, Washington, D.C. It's partially why it's known as Chocolate City, because those things live on. What also lives on, though, is that violence that I spoke of, called gun violence, that was introduced to this country in the 1600s. That isn't over, obviously, and it is impacting all Americans. It is no longer just the kidnapped group of people who were stolen and brought over to this land and are still, as we know, fighting for rights on a daily basis, which also is unacceptable. But I guess I'll sit at another committee hearing for that conversation and discussion. But in the meanwhile, that violence, that is gun violence, has been here since. Now, there's gun violence being enacted or carried out on our families on a day-to-day basis. There was a black man who was murdered in our community here in Washington, D.C. by the Metro Police Department just weeks ago. My stepfather was murdered in 2016 among so many of my other classmates. One of my 7th grade students was shot in his neighborhood this summer. I can go on and on and on and on and on and on and on, but I won't, because you know what exists. You know what's happening. You're going to turn on the news tonight, and you're going to see new young people murdered. I don't know it because I've seen it happen today, but I know it because I've seen it yesterday. And I told you earlier, the fabric of this country lives on. What happened yesterday in this country is going to happen tomorrow unless we do something new. So I'm making a proposal for us to, just as much as we care about policy, which is, extremely important, and I recognize many faces on this committee, and I'm appreciative of the legacy of work that many of you have planted, not only here in buildings like these, but around our nation and even around our world. But also excited for people like Maxwell who have opportunity to create and embark on that journey and create legacy. It's important for me to remember that my personal lineage and the lineage of this nation has gun violence in it. The early stages of this country and the early stages of my life have gun violence in them. In the adulthood of this country and in my own adulthood, gun violence is present. The question now is, will it exist tomorrow? Now, people, you guys know this just like I know it, and you're probably just like I'm teaching my kids, teaching your kids, my students, maybe you're teaching your students or your children, that you can't keep doing the same things expecting different results. So our conversation has to be bigger than policy, as important as policy is. I don't know all the policy choices or what you should do, and that's why I don't run for office, because I wouldn't do well. I would not positively and powerfully serve our people outside of being an influence. And I lean on you all. I lean on directors of research and other politicians to make those policy decisions. What I'm asking for from us is to rewrite the policy of our hearts and to rewrite the policy of our minds. I'm asking for us to rewrite the policy of our hearts, rewrite the policy of our minds. That's an individual decision. Some of us are more committed to the idea of America, which, again, the fabric of America includes gun violence. We have not yet separated those two. We must take it upon ourselves to rewrite the policy, the fabric, not only of ourselves as individuals, but also of the country. If we don't do that, I can tell you, based on history, as a scholar in history and now as a teacher of history, we will be here again. If we do not do something different, then we wasted this time together. And if we're saying we care about the lives of American people, time is one of the last resources we should be wasting. So hopefully, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I can be proud with my students and my children and say, someone heard you, someone heard us. The fabric of this country is being resewn so that gun violence or any form of violence is not a part of it. So when I go back to my students tomorrow, because I left early to come and serve my students in this capacity, they'll ask me, because today they said they were most afraid of gun violence. That was their biggest fear. So why can't they get their homework done? And then I'm going to get on Twitter and somebody's going to say that I'm like some affirmative action DEI black kid who doesn't deserve to have graduated from Harvard or something like that. And then I go back to the schools where I serve my students, and even if they want to read, how can you if your dad is kidnapped by the prison industrial complex and your mother or your father or your friends are murdered? How? I can't go to school and force them to be competent at whatever Twitter's expectations are. So hopefully I can, again, look up in a few years, or 5 or 10, and say that we heard and we listened and we did what was right. David, me, the rest of March, we get tired of like yelling at the rallies and marching all the time. We know what to do. The policymakers, the researchers are continually telling us what decisions to make. Communities, whether it was Tupac Shakur when he was in his 20s, a long time ago, got on microphones like this and already prophesied, so to say, what would come and what the remedies were. We didn't listen. So we have opportunity. Again, we're hearing something new. We have opportunity to do the right thing. It's here. We can or we cannot, and we'll be right back here again.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, for your fine testimony. And now I'm going to Dr. Joseph Sakharin for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ranking Member Raskin and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here to speak today. My name is Joseph Sakharin, and I'm here before you not just as a trauma surgeon or the chief medical officer of Brady, but as a survivor of gun violence. And in fact, exactly 30 years ago to this day, during my senior year of high school, a stray bullet ripped through my throat, nearly killing me. That devastating moment left me with lifelong scars, but also inspired me to commit to saving lives, advancing public health, and advocating for meaningful policy changes to end the senseless carnage of gun violence that has plagued our communities. I got a paralyzed vocal cord, so maybe I need 2 mics. Thank you. And I've decided to, dedicate my career to caring for the vulnerable. But I can tell you with certainty that no matter how skilled of a surgeon I may think I am, the most effective treatment of gunshot wounds is prevention. Gun violence is not only a public health crisis, but as we heard, it's an economic catastrophe that drains resources, shatters families, and cripples communities across America. As a trauma surgeon in East Baltimore, I treat gunshot victims nearly every day and witness gun violence's staggering toll on our healthcare system, our economy, and our future. The economic burden of gun violence is too heavy for families, healthcare systems, and our nation to bear. I urge you to consider the numbers, yes, but most importantly, to consider the cost of gun violence. Consider the lost potential and the financial drain that perpetuates the cycles of poverty, mental health crises, and community disintegration. Every week at trauma centers across this country, over 1,500 gunshot victims occur, including many minors. And hospitalizations for gunshot victims cost over $700 million annually, with Medicaid bearing much of this burden. For minors alone, the cost of emergency department and inpatient care of firearm-related injuries amounts to $270 million per year. And that's only the direct medical expenses, right? It's not the broader societal costs that are even more staggering. These societal costs underscore what happens when a survivor leaves the hospital. In fact, medical costs quadruple after discharge, as ongoing care is required for long-term injuries and disabilities associated with gunshot wounds. Some of my patients went from supporting their families to requiring 24-hour care, right? Ending any hopes of a better life. And while we often focus on the physical injuries, we know, as we've heard today, patients and families experience significant mental and emotional trauma. In fact, survivors are 51% more likely to develop psychiatric conditions and are 85% more likely to suffer from substance use disorders. In 2021 alone, mental illness cost the U.S. economy over $280 billion, and that figure is expected to rise. As highlighted in the recent U.S. Surgeon General's advisory on firearms, the impact of gun violence spills far beyond the survivor, touching families and communities. A 2023 study found that families of those who survive a gunshot wound are significantly far more likely to suffer from a psychiatric condition, with a 12% increase in mental health illness, further contributing to the economic burden. Widespread gun violence impacts the entire community, and in many cases, the fear of violence significantly alters individual and community behavior. A survey of American middle and high school students found that 46% had made at least one change, right, in their daily routine practices because they were concerned about their own personal safety. The broader economic toll of gun violence is staggering, and Baltimore, the community where I live and work in, reflects this. But it's no coincidence that parts of the city that are most impacted by gun violence are also the brown and black communities, suffering from indiscriminatory legislative pieces of the past, whether it's redlining, economic depression, and disinvestment. The whole community suffers when the neighborhood grocer is shot or when a salon closes because the owner has to care for an injured relative or when a promising student is killed. This isn't just a Baltimore issue, but it impacts cities, as we've heard, all across America, including rural communities. The mass shooting that happened at a Buffalo supermarket, which temporarily closed the neighborhood's only grocery store, effectively created a food desert, right? Gun violence doesn't just kill people, but it harms community life, it limits business growth, and it disrupts educational systems. It's such a privilege to be able to deliver life-saving care to patients. And while I love my job, the worst part of my job is having to explain to a mom or dad that their child that left that morning is never coming home again. It's absolutely the worst part. And I just want us to remember, we're talking about numbers and statistics, but these are not numbers and statistics. These are moms and dads, they're sisters and brothers, they're part of our family, they're people that make up the social fabric of our community. And we have a responsibility to do better. So I urge Congress to address, right, the root causes of gun violence through preventative measures that allow us to disrupt what's sitting at the core of this public health problem, which is easy access to firearms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sakran, for your excellent testimony. That completes the witnesses' direct testimony. We're going to go now to questioning by the members. Our two Florida representatives both have to go at 5:15, so we'll begin with them. And the way we're doing this is we're going to allow one or two questions for each member, just because we're running short on time. Mr. Frost, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Moskowitz.
Thank you so much for putting this together, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being here. You know, for people who don't know, gun violence is the issue that got me involved in politics when I was 15 years old, and I'm proud now to be a member of Congress fighting for that and representing my district of Orlando, Florida. You know, I think that, and this question's for anybody on the panel, the mental health has been brought up, which I think is really important. You know, oftentimes folks who are opponents of common sense gun reform will use this issue as a scapegoat to not do anything on the issue. When we know that the impacts of gun violence are, of course, both physical, like the doctor mentioned, but also mental, and can last a lifetime for so many people. And we live in a country that doesn't have health care for everyone. We don't have universal health care. And so a lot of times the folks who find themselves in these situations of gun violence oftentimes don't have the resources to be able to help with the aftermath of this. I'm very happy that we finally have a White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We just celebrated a year of that office just yesterday. It marks a year. And part of the work that office does is to go out to communities and help municipalities and help make sure that people have resources to move forward in this. But this is still a small office, and they're not able to do everything. We have great organizations as well, but we need the government to step up. So would love to hear from anyone on the panel. What do you think we could be doing better as far as the federal government is concerned in making sure that people have the resources they need after these shootings happen to make sure that people are covered?
I think one of the most important things is there's not a timeline when you're going to wake up and it's going to be back to normal. And I think for us, what we saw, people got through the first few years and then something happens and they're saying, where did that come from? When I go out and speak to schools, the class I worried the most about was the class of '99 because they graduated a month after the shooting. And when they were at colleges in different places, they did not have the support that we had at Columbine High School. And I know having conversations with Sandy Hook and even now with the Coventry, it's important that this is going to follow them. All of a sudden, when they move from middle or elementary school to middle school to high school, we need to have the resources, not only for the kids, but for the staff when they go up there. And I think money runs out. There's not a time period when the trauma is not going to disappear. And so I think we got to look at that.
Thank you. I appreciate you bringing this up. Did anyone else?
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention something really quick, which is, we do a really good job when patients are brought into the hospital of understanding the data and what they're facing and treating the physical injuries. But one of the things that we're lacking is what happens when the patient steps outside of the four walls of our hospital or healthcare system. And this gets to kind of the long-term cost and these societal costs that we're talking about. Can people go back to their communities and work? Do they have to be on a ventilator for life? Are they able to reintegrate into society? Do they need physical therapy, occupational therapy? Do they need repeated surgeries? All of these things are so complex and they're integrated into this long-term piece. And right now, we are barely scratching the surface to understanding even the breadth of that problem because we don't have the infrastructure from a data perspective to collect it and understand it, let alone apply the solutions to fix it.
It's almost like everyone needs like a caseworker to be able to work through all these different things. Maybe if some of my colleagues saw the sheer cost of how much it would cost to give every single survivor of gun violence in this country a government caseworker, maybe they would actually act on the issue. My last question, Melissa, I really appreciate your testimony. And when I first got involved in this, I remember going to so many different meetings. I remember one with a certain senator who cried with us, who hugged survivors. This was right after Sandy Hook, and told us, I'm going to do everything I can. And then a couple days later, we were in the gallery in the Senate, and we watched them cast a vote against universal background checks. And I've been in so many of those meetings, and I really appreciate your testimony. And I'm not asking you to speak for all Republicans here, but I'm just curious what you think we need to do as a movement to make sure, because this is a bipartisan issue for the whole country. And when we walk through these doors, it becomes partisan. And I'm just curious what you think we need to do better in the institution. I would say to reach out, but we have reached out, right? And so I'm just curious what you think needs to happen to make sure that this can be bipartisan here like it is outside of these halls.
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, we've worked at the state legislative level for the last year and a half. And as you know, Tennessee's in a supermajority, a Republican supermajority, and we are Republican constituents coming to our Republican leaders saying we want change. I know that change doesn't happen overnight, but I think what we are doing is giving space to other people who are leaning conservative or are gun owners who are constituents to also speak up. I think those people have lost their voice because it's become such a polarized issue. As I said in my testimony, 75% of Tennesseans support red flag laws or temporary transfer, whatever you want to call them. 75%. That's a lot of Republican voters right there, and it's not translating up into the legislature. So I don't know the answer, but I do think more voices on the issue. And I have seen that we have been having conversations and we're not yelling or screaming. We're coming in and we're saying, look, our kids were at a private Christian school and we lean conservative. We look just like you. You need to make change, and we're not going away. We're not going to go away until that change happens. And And so again, I don't know the answer, but I do think that more constituents speaking out, maybe in settings like this, and getting that word out would help.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I do believe that the gun violence prevention movement now is stronger than the gun lobby, and we just got, power for a short amount of time doesn't do much, but sustained power, I think, is how we're going to solve this. And, we have glimmers of hope. I mean, after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, this Republican-led legislature passed gun laws in Florida, and every single one of the Republicans that voted yes on that got reelected. And so I think, there's hope here, and I know Jared will probably talk more about that since he was in that legislature when that happened.
Yeah.
Thank you, Congressman Frost. Congressman Moskowitz.
Oh, well, first, Jamie, thanks for putting this together, and Maxwell for hosting it. I want to thank Ms. Norton, Ms. Presley, Ms. Tlaib, and Ms. Stansberry for being here. I really appreciate it, and thank you to the panelists. So I remember being in the Florida legislature when Pulse happened. And myself, I was a state rep. Darren Soto was a state senator. He's in Congress now also. I remember we tried to pull a maneuver to get our colleagues to come back into the legislative session because we were out of session. And it triggered a vote. Members had a vote just to come into the session to discuss the issue. No proposal, just agree to meet. And every single Republican voted not to even go meet. And then a year and a half later, I had the shooting at my high school, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And I remember exactly where I was when that happened. And I remember finding out later on in that day that my 4-year-old was in a closet around the corner from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas at his preschool. And the teacher that was in the closet with him, her daughter was killed while she was protecting my son in the closet. And that turned out to be Jen Guttenberg, Fred Guttenberg's wife. And the principal from Columbine, I remember exactly what you remember. I attended 7 funerals. I was driving past funerals to go to funerals. I couldn't go to all the funerals. They were all scheduled at the same time. And the impact that that had on the community, makeshift memorials at the park that was taken over. We had to ban fireworks in Parkland because it was triggering the kids in 4th of July. And I remember all of that like it was yesterday, and this February will be 7 years. And I remember telling my wife, I'm just so happy my kids are young and I don't have to explain it to them. Well, my 4-year-old's now 10. And about 3 weeks ago, he asked me about the shooting that happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas because they took the building down finally. And I was proud to bring Vice President Kamala Harris to the building, to go through the building, to look at all the things, the lessons learned, school safety lessons that are learned, gun violence lessons that are learned, training, the difference what training does. How do you lock a door? I mean, simple things that failed, unfortunately, that day. SROs not going into the buildings, all sorts of stuff. But that building just came down, and the mental impact that had on the community when the building came down. Maxwell talked about the bill that we passed. I remember the first instinct I had when I got home when I got to Parkland. I flew home. We were in Tallahassee. I flew home, and I got a tour of the school, and I remember thinking to myself, everyone's going to watch this on TV. They're not going to see it. So I had a weird feeling. I was like, let me call the Speaker of the House. We're friends. Let me see if he'll come down here. And so the Republican and the Speaker of the House came down, and he saw the school, and we literally went to dinner and started drafting the bill on a napkin that night. And it was, we agreed that there were things that we weren't going to agree on. I asked for an assault weapons ban. He was like, that's not going to happen. And I said, okay, well, that's your boundary. Here are my boundaries. And we eventually settled on 3-day waiting periods, red flag laws, and raising the age to 21 because our gunman was 18. And anyways, that passed. We'll skip. That passed. But in the last 6 years, red flag laws in Florida have been used 19,000 times in 6 years. So 19,000 times law enforcement has deemed someone a danger to themselves, a danger to others. Suicide, domestic violence, mass shooters. In my county, since school started, 4 kids have been arrested for making threats online to shoot up a school in 45 days. And that's where real crime comes in, monitoring kids, what they're saying on Facebook or what they're saying on Instagram.
some of these kids think it's funny. By the way, this wasn't all public schools. It was private schools also. A lot of parents think this isn't my problem. Private schools don't have this problem. It's coming there too, by the way. It just hasn't happened yet. So Florida was like lightning in a bottle, and I worked with the kids from March for Our Lives and the parents who crisscrossed the country who came up there, and yeah, we got lightning in a bottle. We got a completely Republican legislature and a completely Republican Senate and a completely Republican governor who then became a U.S. Senator to do gun violence prevention, and we beat Marion Hammer, the strongest NRA lobbyist at the time. Everyone was an A-plus rated member of the NRA, and Maxwell's right. All these people got reelected. Not just reelected, they got promoted. Governor became a U.S. Senator. That speaker who wrote the bill with me on a napkin became the Secretary of Education who put the Safer Schools office, the first Safer Schools office in Florida, in the Department of Education. He now runs a college. The appropriations chair who got me the $25 million to build a new building in Parkland, because I knew the kids were never going back into the old building, he became an ambassador in the Trump administration. And so this idea that it cannot happen, I saw it happen. I was part of it. I was there. And I always give the Republicans credit in my state for doing the right thing. Now, something weird happens when you come to D.C., because the senator who was governor at the time, who signed that bill, who still says he supports the bill in the state, but says it's a state's issue. He doesn't want to do anything up here. So there's something weird in the water up here on why we can't seem to get it done. State legislatures are doing more than we are. Mr. Brown, I wanted to ask a question because I thought your testimony was compelling. One of the things that I have wondered, because you're now kind of the second generation of March for Our Lives kids coming, or third generation, right? Yeah, second generation, because you were in high school when Parkland happened, right? All right. What do you say to the kids that are like coming up now, who 6 years after Parkland or 6 years after March for Our Lives, who are like, but nothing has happened. Like, we can't get anything to happen. How do you keep yourself motivated, or how do you keep kids motivated for staying involved or keeping the moon when they feel they're not seeing progress?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's a tough question because comparatively, when I look at my real life, it's going to be hard for me to say nothing has happened for these kids who think that nothing has happened. I mean, there are so many policy wins as it pertains to gun violence prevention at a national level, so many policy wins as it pertains to gun violence even at a local level, in terms of solving some of these issues that we're discussing, like mass shootings. And I'm saying there's been a ton because I'm a black American whose problems don't get solved in this country. So when I look at what March for Our Lives has been able to accomplish in 4 years or 5 years, I know organizations that have been working for 150 years and can't do half of what March and so many other beautiful people have put their money, their time, their energy, American people, and politicians, all of which have put their resources together to make things happen. So are all the things we want to happen happening? No. That's why we're here. But certainly, I've sat with so many families, Uvalde survivors or Columbine survivors, and who have said thank you to March and so many Congress members for what they have done. And so that's why I emphasize that I'm happy about us having a policy conversation. Like that's what you guys are here for, and that's what we're here for. But also, beyond it, I think what's going to make sort of close that gap is making sure that, like you said, that's something in the water. Whatever is in the water, I didn't vote for y'all to let something in the water stop you from making the right choices. So something in the water is not a state or a national problem, it's a personal problem. And that's what I emphasized earlier when I said we have to update our hearts and our minds as individuals, because a lot of what we're waiting on when I talk to the young people, it's like they told me today, they don't think they can do anything. They think the problems are bigger than them. But in my hood, that makes sense because they've literally not got anything done in terms of policy. So I want to see y'all in my school building and in all the school buildings around D.C. showing these kids what it looks like to make policy change, period. If you do not do that, these things will not change in my community.
No, thank you. And my second question is for anyone on the panel, but you could take it too, Mr. Brown. One of the things that I realized after Parkland or during Parkland while I was going through it is I started getting parents reaching out to me about, their kid was killed, or, my kid was playing basketball and a stray bullet just killed them while they were playing basketball, or they were driving on the highway and a stray bullet killed my kid. And I realized that, when Parkland happened 6 years ago, we had 17 people that were killed, but there were 200 people that had been killed by random acts of gun violence in Miami-Dade County within the last 10 years, right? And those stories are only even on the local news, barely, if you're lucky. And so one of the things, and I think March for Our Lives has done a great job with this, is that, yes, these mass shootings are horrific, school shootings are horrific, but we also have to talk about the daily gun violence, because if you look at the totality of the numbers, if it's a numbers game, the daily gun violence way outweighs the mass shootings. Now, it's not one or the other, it's all bad. But when I talk to young people, that's something that they bring up as well, which is it's all. We have to do both. Anyone can address that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say,
Please.
we heard how the ranking member started by, talking about how exactly like you're saying, the mass shootings are less than, 2% of the public health problem that we're facing. And every day in cities like Baltimore, right, there are young black men that are being slaughtered on our streets. And for a long time, no one talked about those stories, right? It's not until recently where we've started to kind of shift the focus. And if we want to be honest, right, it wasn't until suburban white schools started getting shot up that people started paying attention. Just last week, we had 8 people that were killed, just a few blocks from the hospital, right, from a mass shooting. This is constantly continuing to happen. So I think the focus that you're talking about is critical. And what I would say is that when you think about what is happening in America right now, people are desensitized, okay? Think about who's exposed to the carnage, right, in general. It's the kids that have to witness these horrific shootings and are lucky enough to survive. It's the parents that have to identify their kids, some of which are unidentifiable, as we saw in Uvalde. And it's the first responders, the medical examiners, the trauma surgeons, right? The people that are there on the front lines taking care. But everyone else, they're not witness to the type of carnage that these bullets are causing. And I think that's caused an incredible disconnect. And I hear it all the time. People say, oh, another shooting. It's not a shooting, it's a massacre. And I think that disconnect is terribly problematic.
Thank you, Dr. Zuckerman. Thank you, Congressman Moskowitz. Ms. Tlaib, you're recognized for your couple questions.
So much. I heard that, Professor. A couple questions. Thank you all so much. I think it's been incredible. This is allergies, I promise. I promise, Doc, this is allergies. Ms. Alexander, you said something really powerful that resonated with me about access. Been working on this issue around a bill called Safe Storage, Save Lives Act. And it's because the Children's Hospital in Michigan right now, our ER, our chief in the ER, we had our press conference on this bill, Ranking Member Raskin. They're passing out storage boxes for the guns because the number one various things that come in through the emergency right now is related to gun shootings. Children. This is the Children's Hospital in Michigan. And, she kept, she's talked about it and through this lens of public health. It was incredible. But I just, at that moment, thought to myself, in our country right now, the emergency department, not flu shots, not, a vaccine, whatever you want to call them, they're now passing out gun boxes to store guns. And so, even hearing all of you, it's so hard sometimes talking about the economic impact makes me feel, oof, because why do we have to talk about it, But even when my friend Ashby, who's here, who's a survivor of the Highland Park 4th of July shooting, she goes, I've spent $65,000, my husband and I, to help Bo, her son, who's 6 years old at the time. He has IEP now. For those in the doctor, Principal D, this, the IEP program, because he needs a lot of the wraparound support and programming. Mrs. Alexander, when you talked about it, it really resonated with me. I want to, any sense of how I can talk about it, especially in Michigan, and not saying, because immediately people will start saying to me, "Oh, she's trying to take my guns away from me." And I'm sorry we're already asking this, but this is really genuinely me like trying to figure out how better I can talk about storing guns. Like, you buy a gun, store it properly. I talk about one of my local police officers, 2-year-old child got a hold of his gun, shot herself, gone, because he just didn't lock it away. And Ashby always tells me, Rashida, before you have your kid go to any house, you ask if there's any guns in there and if it's stored. And I thought to myself, is that what we have to start conditioning ourselves before our children go and visit their friends? So yes, Mrs. Alexander, my next question is this for Dr. Sekran.
Well, what you just said, it's interesting because I got appointed to the Child Fatality Review Board in the state of Tennessee, and I had my first call this morning. So I flew to D.C., had my first call, and there was a presentation on gun deaths in Tennessee, and it was all around safe storage. And one of the things she said was, we have to condition ourselves as parents. Before you send a child over to a home, you need to ask the question, do you have firearms and are they safely stored? I can tell you my biggest fear as a responsible gun owner is something should happen to a child accidentally in my house. Most responsible gun owners think that way. We have to remind people that there is an easy, children, in the presentation she said, even if you think your children don't know where the guns are, they know where the guns are, and they're very curious, and they need to be educated not to touch them. And if there's one lying around, you need to walk away. Don't pick it up. Go walk away and tell an adult. But from a gun owner's perspective, I mean, you could put it back on them. It's interesting because there's no liability to gun manufacturers. All the liability is on that person that's the owner, right? And I've heard children never get over if they accidentally shoot somebody and they die. That child who accidentally shot that person never gets over it.
Happens in my district all the time.
You have to just try and educate people the best you can, and maybe get some gun owner voices who are responsible to join in that conversation.
That's a great idea. When I go to the floor to talk about it, I hold this orange thing. It looks kind of like a bike lock. $10 just to use it to lock a gun. Dr. Sekran, when the ER doctor talked to me, and just so you all know, just this past week, one of my schools in Southfield, a 15-year-old boy came in with a gun, and we had a program when I was in the State House. We passed OK to Say. It's basically a hotline for students to call about anything, and we were able to save lives. We were able to get that gun before it was used by that 15-year-old because another student called OK to Say. And I know we're doing everything we can on the state level, but it was really powerful to hear the principal tell me, thank God for OK to Say. And we passed that in the legislature over 10 years ago. Dr. Sekran, I've been trying to generally this is a public health crisis. Like, the number one death right now for children is gun violence and gun shootings. And, even now, I love that, Mr. Brown talked about this because it's not just schools. Like, in my community, it was a splash pad. Somebody come and shot up a splash pad. Eastern Market, where we go buy our fruit and stuff. Since I was a little kid, ranking member, I'd go over there, because that's where you got the more lower cost tomatoes and everything. I mean, a block club. I mean, it's just overwhelming the number of, gun shootings, mass shootings where, children, it's always children that seem to be the victims, and then later even survivors that witness it. Can you talk about, in some sense, of course, we talked about the cost of it because of public health, but talk about what we can do in our sense of like how we can maybe put in our budget within, like, in the health department, specifically around survivors of gun violence. Even hearing my friend Ashby talk about $65,000, I'm like, how can she afford that's terrible. Like, a lot of people, she's blessed maybe in that sense, but a lot of people can't afford that wraparound service of providing for our families who are, again, I think every corner of our country is now a survivor or been impacted by gun violence in our country. And that's the two questions.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. And look, you're spot on, right? It's staggering to think that the leading cause of death for children and adolescents in America is gun violence. It's not car crashes, it's not cancer, it's not poisonings. And sometimes when I think about that, it's just even just hard to kind of wrap my mind around it. I think the point that is so critical that often gets missed, and you started kind of talking about this in your first question, as you were starting to talk about the different solutions that you've seen, is the reason this is a public health crisis is because there is no one solution. Like, it requires a multifaceted approach for us to really be able to tackle the complexity of this problem. And I think one of the things that has been significantly lacking is when you look at, cities and states across this country, and even at the federal level, right, they're siloed off. To be able to really effectively move the needle forward, you have to break down the silos where the different sectors, right, are working hand in hand. So it's the healthcare system working with the education folks, working with businesses, working with the public health department, most importantly, working with the community, right? The people that are closest to the struggle, who, by the way, understand the solution, but need to be brought in as real partners. And that type of approach, right, I think will require us to really kind of think about, well, how do we do all these different things? If we're talking about suicide prevention, the solutions are not going to necessarily be the same as if we're talking about urban violence, right? And then some of the solutions that we have are short and medium-term solutions, but some of them are long-term solutions. At Brady, for example, we have a Shogun Safety campaign where we're working with the entertainment industry to try to really expose Americans to practices of responsible gun ownership. You talked about the police officer and that tragic shooting. Imagine if people sitting in their living rooms when they come in, instead of seeing, someone put the gun right on the desk, they put it in a safe storage box, right? You don't even have to say anything. It's those type of behaviors, and it doesn't change overnight, that long-term will allow us to have the type of social norm and cultural transformation. That on top of course, funding for data, right? Expanding background checks, right? Making sure that we have the extreme risk protection orders, and underscoring the fact that this is not a Democratic issue, it's not a Republican issue. It's a uniquely American issue. And you're absolutely right. The majority of Americans, right, they agree with the common sense solutions. And oftentimes, right, what happens is the leadership doesn't always represent the membership. We saw that in the NRA, and we've seen it in many other scenarios.
Thank you, Ms. Norton, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm really interested in what members of Congress can do. So my question really is, what action should the federal government take to ensure that schools have the appropriate resources before and after a shooting? That's a question for any of you.
Perhaps, yeah, Ms. Greer, if you would take that, and I know we want to pick up with you, Mr. DeAngelis, too.
I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I have a large amount of faith in the educators of our nation, they are seeing the problem with language around mental health needs. At this time, I would say most adults and definitely children do not have the language necessary to communicate not only to their adults or caregivers the struggle they're having with mental health, much less the fact that we don't have somebody as a professional that can meet that need. So I believe our educators will find a way to, and our curriculum developers will start teaching children to have that language. But I think that is the beginning of what we have to do. And it's not just in the schools we need to teach the language. We need to start teaching the parents that when your child, uses these words and is telling you they're having these struggles, this is like going to the pediatrician. It's not something that should be looked down upon, that you're trying to find a psychologist or a counselor for your child. I think one of the things the federal government can do is continue to fund programs that allow us to get mental health professionals throughout the nation, because there are, we are familiar with the term food deserts. There are mental health deserts across our nation, and even if our schools, our educators meet that need, our superintendents, our principals get the mental health professionals in our K-12 setting, those individuals graduate. And the transition to needing the community-based health, mental health, is not there. So I think that's one of the big things that we can start with is the education, meaning let's learn the language of what signifies in, our mental health. What is a healthy person in mental health? What are things that are really challenges that you need to communicate to people? And then let's get professionals in places to support once we do that.
And I really want to touch upon something you said, because I can remember it was after the Parkland shooting, and I had a House rep say, I can guarantee you 100% if we had tougher gun laws, there was never going to be another school shooting. And I said, I disagree. And he said, how can you be in the principal? And I said, let me explain. It takes more than just that. Do we need laws that need to be fixed? Most definitely. But don't lay out the mental health component. Don't lay out the social media component. And one of the things we have to do, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow, the role that kids play, because they hear about a lot of these events that are going to be happening. And we need to have those relationships with parents and others that if they see something, to say something. And one of the things that I saw towards the end of my career, that we saw a lot of these kids being raised by their grandparents and even great-grandparents. Now, I'm a grandfather, but the way I raised my kid is different than the way we're raising kids now. We almost need parenting classes and support for all the others that are raising these kids. They need those adults, and we got to put all these pieces of the puzzle together in order to combat these from happening.
Yeah, I agree with all the statements that have been made and want to emphasize that if we don't look at the role of public schools, which has evolved over not only the last 30 years or 20 years, but certainly the last 100 years or more, if we don't look at the role of public schools in the fabric of this country, then we'll probably keep missing the mark too. Because schools are probably required to do more for students than they were 20 years ago. And so if we continue to discuss schools through the same lens as yesterday, we'll always be missing the mark. So we have to understand the way that schools are actually serving students today so that we can appropriately address the students' needs.
Very good. All right, we're going to come to Ms. Stansberry, and then I will ask a question when she's done with her questioning.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melanie Stansbury, and I represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, which is Albuquerque and Central New Mexico. And I first of all just want to say thank you to our survivors for coming and telling your stories, and to our educators and to our public health officials for helping our families and children get through these tragedies. It's certainly very emotional to hear these stories. And I think there's probably not a community in the United States where gun violence has not touched down, and so probably every single one of us has a story. I was hoping that Representative Presley would be able to go before me, because she and I just came back from Georgia. And we were just there this weekend with Representative Nikema Williams and Mark Kelly, and of course Gabby Giffords. And we actually were in the community that was the victim of a school shooting just a few weeks ago at the high school that happened in Appalachia. And we held a gun safety forum in a church not far from the high school, and a lot of people came out for it. And I will not do her words justice, and I hope that she'll come back and say them herself. But one of the things that Representative Presley said at that forum that I found so profound is she said that when a person loses their spouse, they're called a widow. When someone loses a parent, they're called an orphan. But there is no word in the English language for when a person loses their child, because it goes against the natural order and is so unthinkable. And that's what we're here talking about today. You know, we have, unfortunately, a set of candidates running for higher office right now who made some controversial remarks after that Georgia school shooting. And I was shocked not only to hear one of them say, oh, school shootings are a fact of life, but more extensive comments that were made about how it's not about the guns and that people just need to suck it up and live with this. But I have to ask myself, what kind of country are we choosing? What kind of society are we choosing to live in where our children are literally afraid to go to school? Where parents literally hold their breath every single time they hear that there's a shelter in place, where we have people in communities across the country who've experienced gun violence in grocery stores and churches, or just standing outside their home. In fact, my own personal connection to gun violence happened just 2 years ago. A former campaign staffer of mine was gunned down outside of his house. And I think there's not an American that doesn't have a story that is connected to this senseless violence. And we are the only country in the world that is an upper income country that is choosing, that is making the policy decision to not address the systemic epidemic of gun violence. It is a choice. It's a policy choice. What kind of madness is this country choosing for itself that we are choosing to allow thousands of deaths a year, 48,000 deaths, 11 minutes, every 11 minutes a shooting is happening from gun violence. It's sort of unimaginable, right, that we would make this choice here in the United States. In New Mexico, I was serving in the state legislature, similar to Mr. Moskowitz, when we passed some of the most comprehensive gun safety legislation. And my own state house representative who took my seat helped to pass a law called Benny's Law. And my representative, Pamela Herndon, passed this bill after a 13-year-old was gunned down by one of his classmates at Washington Middle School in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But I have to say that it is shocking every day in this building that we cannot move even the most basic legislation that is bipartisan. We have legislation on the House floor that we cannot even get enough signatures to move to a vote that is just sitting there. It's been sitting there for months because our colleagues across the aisle are too afraid to take action because they believe that the gun lobby will come after them and take them out in their next election. I think it's impossible to talk about this issue and not be political about it because it is politics. It's not in the water. It's politics. It's that our colleagues across the aisle are refusing to address a gun epidemic because they think it's bad politics for them. That's what's going on here. And so we're allowing thousands of Americans to be slain every year because of politics. So I implore my colleagues to take action. But I think this discussion that was had over the last few minutes about mental health, and I appreciate our survivors sharing their own stories in the aftermath. But we have a teenager at home in my life, and kids are just having such a mental health crisis right now. Even kids who are not survivors. They say over half of children are suffering from depression and mental health issues right now. And you cannot ignore that that is not a symptom of the fact that they're afraid to go to school because of gun violence. So we're also allowing this epidemic of violence that is actually resulting in the death of children to cause our entire population to be experiencing mental health crises at home. So the question I would like to ask, and I think it's been addressed in some ways, but how do we get more meaningful resources into our communities to really bring about culture change to help our kids get through this difficult era? And I'll say one thing before I open it up maybe to our educators. I'd love to hear from you. I went last week. President Biden was honoring the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act. And he shared a story that when he started holding hearings about domestic violence in the U.S. Senate, his colleagues told him it was too controversial to talk about violence in the home publicly because it was too taboo of a subject. And he said, not only did we change the law, we changed the culture by talking about it, by exposing it, by making sure that we made resources available, and that's really the legacy of that law. So I know you all have been asked this in different ways, but what is the legacy that this Congress needs to leave for our children. And I'll open it up to anyone who feels moved to share.
Well, I'm most passionate about education. I came from D.C., and D.C. public schools, some say, is the worst performing public school system in the country. I can't say yes or no absolutely, but I can say of the 3 or 5 places that I've lived, certainly the worst. And I don't think that's the fault of the chancellor. I don't think that's the fault of any one person, because this is the history of this public school system. But also, when you measure the American public school system against countries around the world, you can also get that same sort of depressing feeling about the results. So what I'd love to see is the leaders of this country, whom, again, we go out to the polls to elect, would reimagine education with confidence. Another thing I'm asking for from our elected officials is to be confident about what the people need. Because as much as we need you to listen to us, we need you to make decisions when we don't know what to do. And we are just as lost, I think, as many of you. However, where you guys can win is where you and Ms. Presley did win, is going to get on the ground and learn what people need. I think that the most effective leaders that I've been around are leaders who hear what's needed and then make it happen. The ones who wait to hear what everybody else thinks and what everybody else thinks and what everybody else thinks tend to not get the decisions made. So there's enough data out there. There's enough people you can call to get the answers on what data needs to be, what decisions need to be made based on the data. I'm saying, again, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that education needs to look different because teachers are raising children. It's just what the truth is, right? Principals are therapists as well, whether they go and get their degree in that or not. So writing policy around the reality of the American experience as opposed to the idea of the American experience, I think is probably going to bring us some more positive results.
Thank you. I think Mr. Johnson and Ms. Burnsharp.
My encouragement would be to get some young people up here instead of these old people. Not referring to myself as well. One thing as principals that we in our our guide to recovery, we stress the importance of student voice. One thing I learned about my community, and every community is different, but in order to best help my community, I need to listen to my students. And that's what we encourage every principal to do. And every time that I get students in front of me, I am amazed by the insight that they bring. So I guess my encouragement would be to listen to young people. In Ohio, we had a safety summit, and they had a panel of students up front. And I can remember the one question was asked to a group of students is, do you feel safe at school? And if so, what makes you feel safe? And a student from my school spoke up and said, I think I'm the only person up here who's experienced a school shooting, but what makes me feel safe is we do drills, and I know how to lock the door of my classroom, and I know how to open the window of my classroom. And in her case, she said, I understand that a drill can be re-traumatizing, but for me, and this is a student talking, for me, it increases my feeling of safety because I heard about students who felt powerless, who didn't know if that door was locked and couldn't open that window. So the fact that I get a chance to practice that at school is empowering to me. Now, she's not speaking for everybody. She's speaking for herself and her school. But my encouragement would be to get students in front of you. And I think the other thing that has been mentioned, and we experienced with our school, after the shooting, when we were looking at ways to make our school safer, it seemed like for a little while, everything that was suggested, somebody else would counter that that's not going to prevent. And that's true. It's not going to prevent. But is it going to make it safer? So I think you mentioned, even if there's small steps towards safer, those are steps in the right direction. I don't think we're going to find that one magical thing that gets rid of all gun violence or all violence in schools. But if we can come together to take small steps to make things safer, I think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, Ms. Burnsharp.
So I endorse what you're saying. I think one of the things that's upsetting to me is I watch schools really struggle to figure out, like, we got to do something, let's do something, is that a lot of the things that are being done actually aren't evidence-based. There's no research that shows that they actually work to prevent school shootings. And when you understand who the shooters are, more times than not, more than 3 and 4 times, it's a student or a former student. More times than not, they got their gun from a close family member or their parents. That should really inform us better about what to do about school shootings. And one of the things that I think over and over again you see with young people who are in deep, deep crisis is that they're isolated. They feel marginalized. They are struggling. They come from a home situation that's deeply unstable or, abusive or whatever. And they didn't have an adult in the school, in many cases, who they felt comfortable talking to. And other kids, many of whom knew what was going on, also didn't feel comfortable in the school. Finding at least one adult who they could speak with. And I think that that's really an issue that we have to face head on and grapple with.
Yep.
I think something that's important that we learned after Columbine, we train our teachers of pedagogy and curriculum, but that social emotional learning piece is important. And what ends up happening is our teachers are not trained. And I don't care what curriculum you have, if they don't know how to deal with some of this. And I think as a nation, we learned about this after the pandemic with these kids. And I think it's training them. And it's the same thing with counselors. Because a lot of times in our school, counselors, they're trained for career counseling and things like that. They're not trained for grief counseling and trauma counseling. So I think it's this training. It's not that teachers don't want to do it. They don't know how to do it. And I think those training programs are important. And one last point, I think more and more parents are concerned about sending their kids to school, and a lot of them are homeschooling, but these parents don't know how to deal with some of the things that we talked about earlier if a kid is showing signs of trauma. And so we need to have programs for them also.
Thank you all. And I'll just say in closing, in 2020, we had a couple of really tragic suicides at the high schools that were in my state house district. And the students of the high school actually went to a school board meeting to try to get more counseling and mental health services. And the school board said, we don't have the resources to do that. And so these students actually wrote a bill. We took it to the legislature. They testified in front of the legislature, and we were able to get more funding into the schools. And so I want to say to any students, any young people out there, to those of you who have been advocating, to Mr. Frost, who's now here in Congress, your voices are changing the world. So don't be afraid to stand up and ask for what you need. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stansberry. When I was first approached by the principals from the Principal Recovery Network, Mr. Johnson and Ms. Greer and Mr. DeAngelis, and I spent a few hours with them and some other principals, and to me it was an absolutely demolishing experience to hear first about the grief and the trauma surrounding the original attacks and the loss and the pain of that, and then the struggle to just get the basic resources to deal with the psychological fallout and the continuing emotional trauma of the situation. And some of the schools, of course, needed to be torn down and rebuilt. And that's what got me thinking about the financial costs, the economic costs, of somebody being in a wheelchair for the rest of their life, somebody needing a ventilator, somebody needing full-time 24/7 or 12/7 assistance. And obviously, if the humanitarian meaning of gun violence is not enough to move us, we need to expand the conversation. And my first thought about that was that of my friend Ms. Tlaib, which is, wow, are we really going to try to put this in social and economic terms and not just the terms of human life? But in truth, we've got to do that to get people to see the staggering consequences of unbridled gun violence in America. So, Dr. Sakran, let me start with you. As I was listening to you talk, and you're describing as an emergency room physician dealing with gun violence on a daily basis, and sometimes multiple casualties people are dealing with, multiple woundings. What is your response to the kind of economic and political blockade against dealing with this? It's almost as if there are certain people in society who have to deal with the consequences of gun violence, and then there are certain people who make money on it and profit from it as a business model. And so you seem to be a pretty good-humored man, but at a certain point, I would think that would begin to weigh on you, that you understand that this is a successful business model for some people and a successful political model for some people, but it's a nightmare in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people across the country.
Yeah, and I think that you summed it up perfectly. It is a nightmare. It's a nightmare that most people never even have a chance of beginning to understand. I had this 16-year-old kid that I took care of who had a gunshot wound to the head. And, most of these gunshot wounds to the head, they don't come in awake talking, and this kid was. And the only thing after I saw his imaging that I could think of was I had a certain amount of time to connect this kid with his family because I knew it wouldn't be long before he would not be able to do that. And, when his mom shows up, devastating traumatic brain injury, his mom shows up to the ICU, and I'm looking through, we have these glass windows, I'm looking through the glass windows, and I see her holding on to his hand, holding on to kind of that last, glimmer of hope. And I walk in there with the team, the nurses, the medical students, and I began to explain to this mom, right, that just saw her child that morning, of the devastating brain injury that he had. And as I did this, she began to tell me how he was the first in their family to graduate from high school, which, in Baltimore and the black community is a big deal. He had hopes and dreams of going to college, none of which will ever come true. And as she did this, she looked up and, she saw our team was, of course, devastated. And she walked over and she did something that I've never forgotten. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "Are you okay?" And I tell that story because I just want you to think about this for a second. Here's a mom that just lost her child and she's asking us if we're okay. It's those type of moments that restore my faith in humanity and that get us as healthcare professionals to wake up every day to try to do everything we can to prevent these injuries and deaths from happening. I was lucky that I survived my gunshot wound to the throat. And it's just incredibly disappointing that I feel like most Americans are so shielded from the carnage that we continue to see on the streets of Baltimore and all across this country. And I think, you talked about the story with President Biden and how the law changed the culture. At Brady, which was started by Sarah and Jim Brady, she used to say, if you can't change the law, change the lawmaker. Like, we all, right? We all know what we have to do. It's like Mr. Brown said, it's time to actually get it done.
Let me just follow up with Ms. Bird-Sharp's. You also had very powerful testimony that I almost want you to restate, just speaking directly to the audience. Let me pose it to you this way. If we were to give the firearm manufacturers and the gun dealers in America and the politicians who insulate them from liability and protect the free flow of arms without reasonable gun safety laws that are perfectly consistent with the Constitution, if we were to present them a bill, a price tag on an annual basis for what it's costing the educators, the schools, the taxpayers, the victims, their families in medical care, emergency trauma care, long-term psychiatric and medical, if we were going to present a bill, what would the bill be to the gun industry?
I think the way to do it is to look at the number of gun deaths each year and the number of non-fatal gun injuries each year, and they come with a price tag. I mean, that is something that, through a lot of calculations, you can calculate.
So how much is it costing America to live like this?
It's costing $557 billion every year.
Wait, I want you to lean into your microphone and tell us how much it's costing the United States of America to allow tens of thousands of people to be killed and wrenched from their families forever, and how much then we have to continue to pay to keep that business model going for the firearms manufacturers and the dealers and the people who support them.
Yeah, I mean, It's that $557 billion a year, year after year. It's not 1 year of it, because as everybody has said here, somebody who's injured and survives often requires years of support, whether it's physical or mental or, life, circumstances, or the caregivers, often women, who need to change their own lives so that they can care for a person who's disabled for the rest of their life.
So just to be clear about this, you're saying it's costing us more than $500 billion a year to support the worst gun violence in the wealthy world, which means since Columbine took place back in 1999, we have spent trillions of dollars to support the firearm manufacturers and their support for politicians who have walled us off from the reasonable, common sense gun safety legislation we need, like a universal violent criminal background check, red flag laws, ban on military-style assault weapons. So we pay in life, we pay in treasure to keep this going. Is that what you're basically telling us?
Yeah, and because we're paying those costs for failure to prevent things, we're not able to invest in the things that actually would prevent these things from happening in the first place. And yet we know more and more every year what needs to happen. Many of these, incidents of gun violence are preventable.
All right, I'm going to turn this over to our colleague Corey Bush, who has arrived from St. Louis, Missouri. But before that, I just want to say one thing, which is I appreciate so much all of the witnesses coming. I appreciate my colleagues for coming. I appreciate the press that has arrived. This is a roundtable. It is not a hearing because we were not able to get the Republican majority to call a hearing on the long-term effects of the gun violence crisis in America. But I assure you, when we get into the next Congress, I am making you this promise. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure we come back again as a hearing and not just as a roundtable, so the whole country can hear the critical things that you all are saying. Ms. Bush, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ranking Member Raskin. And let me say thank you also to Representatives Frost and Moskowitz for convening alongside you this important roundtable discussion. And thank you to all of our panelists for being here and for how you've dedicated your time, your talent, your energy, your hearts to addressing the gun violence crisis in our communities. You know, it's a shame we're not having, like Ranking Member Raskin said, a full committee hearing on this topic, and that our GOP colleagues would rather hold their heads, put their heads down in the sand when it comes to enacting policies that will save lives. And I'm sitting over here trembling, like I'm trembling. Because I was just sitting here as you all were speaking, just thinking about how, we get to a certain point when our children, hit, once they're pretty much out of pull-ups, then we're ready to teach them how to ride a bike, and we're looking at bike safety, and we're so careful about making sure those training wheels are right, and we're running behind them, and just like really careful about that. Like, how do they have the hat? I mean, do they have the helmet and their arms? They have the pads on their arms and knees and everything. Take one off and not the other, and it's just a whole thing. And then it's time to cross the street. We're teaching them how to cross the street, and we're so careful about crossing the street because we want to protect these kids. But then when it comes to guns, then it's like, it's free. Do what you will. Let social media teach you about guns. And I'm trembling because, it matters who we allow in these seats, as you spoke to, Dr. Cochran. And what you said, also, Rep. Stansberry. So let me just start with how I am standing up here for my community, representing St. Louis. St. Louis and I are here today to say that every school shooting is a heartbreaking policy failure. That no student should ever have to go to school in fear, that no parent should ever have to watch their child walk into the school doors and worry if they're going to come back out. No educator should ever have to be forced to risk their lives to pursue their education or be forced to learn how to use a gun. to pursue their profession, I'm sorry. Yet this constant trauma and devastation is the enduring reality of schools all across our country. And I remember being a girl from the Midwest, I remember tornado drills as a child. I remember it was serious business, tornado drills, fire drills. Fire drills were, I didn't really too much care about. You know, you walk through the motions. I just never thought there'd be a fire. I understood as a child that this was just us learning what to do. But the tornado drill was different because it was physical. Because you had to get down on the floor, you had to put your hands over your head, and there was this whole thing, and it helped you to see that like something could happen to my body. Stay away from the windows, have to be in a particular place, the door frame, and all of these things. But now we have the kids who are killing each other accidentally, and it's one after the other, and we just push it to the side. Social media videos over and over, and we just see the next one. We push it to the side. We're being desensitized to it. Missouri has the 5th highest gun death rate in the United States. And as a survivor of gun violence myself, representing Missouri's First, this issue hits so close to home. Threats of school shootings continue to be on the rise across this country, and including in my district. There have been 20 threats of gun violence reported against schools in just the last 2 weeks in my district. Our community is still reeling from a 2022 shooting at the Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in St. Louis, which is a predominantly black school. And just last week, a person with a loaded gun was arrested in the parking lot of another school in my district after posting on social media that he was going to go up there and cause harm. Had that day ended differently, it could have been another CVPA, another Appalachia, another Parkland, another Robb Elementary, and the list goes on. You know, we understand that students exposed to gun violence report increased anxiety and fear and depression and trauma, reduced academic performance, but go to school and learn. And then the behavioral issues. These issues often disproportionately harm Black and brown and marginalized students. So Dr. Sakrin, I'd like to talk to you about the long-term impact of gun violence on our historically excluded students. How do the mental health and academic impacts of gun violence in our schools specifically affect Black and brown students who may already face additional stressors?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that question. And it's one that is very real, because even if for a second, right, you just look at the entire country, we know that there is a significant lack of access when it comes to mental health and behavioral services, when it comes to just even the long-term ability for us to treat some of the disabilities and the injuries that we are seeing. Now imagine, right, you talk about marginalized, vulnerable populations like brown and Black communities, and you just have to increase that by tenfold and even greater in some circumstances. Our infrastructure is not equipped where we're able to provide the type of resources, right, and the type of care that's needed, not just to care for people that are injured and lucky enough to survive, but also people that are injured, and guess what? We don't want them to come back in with another injury, which we know in some communities like Baltimore, 40% will be back within 5 years. And so there is a significant gap that exists. And this is part of what, I think we've been talking about all afternoon, is how do we, number one, capture the right data when people are leaving the hospital? How do we ensure, right, that we're approaching this in a multifaceted way so that we can provide access to mental health therapists, right, to folks that are needing, other types of treatment, whether it's surgeries, prescriptions. I mean, the list just continues to go on. And when you specifically focus on brown and Black communities, it's just absolutely devastating. And it's disproportionate, and that's very clear in what we've seen.
Thank you for that. And as a nurse myself who has worked in the surgical units, yeah. ICU, it would always be a bad day when I would pull up in front of the hospital and blood is in the street. Yeah. Toss the body out of the car and just left the body there, and people would drive off.
Well, and can I just add, that's why in your own district, people like LJ Punch, right, that are doing that work at the Brick, right?
Yes.
That type of work doesn't exist across the country. Imagine if you had, the brick exponentially, put in cities across America where they were getting these wraparound services, and this often doesn't get highlighted. So I hear what you're saying, and that's why we're here today, right?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you for bringing up Dr. Punch. Doing amazing work. We were able to get Dr. Punch funded through community projects. Yes. Thank you for that. And let me ask Mr. Brown, can you speak to the importance of taking a public health approach to the gun violence epidemic?
Well, if I speak to that, everybody in here will go to sleep because I won't know what the heaven I'm talking about. But I do want to emphasize my gratitude and appreciation for you taking the positions that you've taken. We met at the 2022 March for Our Lives rally, and you telling your story about being a gun violence survivor yourself was awe-inspiring. And the reason why is, I come from communities like like this one here in D.C., which we're in a safe place right now, but safe for some. But for where I grew up, it wasn't that way, and where I teach, it isn't that way, and where I live, it isn't that way. So I'm saying thank you, because you don't have to keep waking up to do this work and fighting to do this work. It's like some people can come to work and go home, and that be their peace, or that be their sort of safety, so to say. And some others have to fight to get to work, and then fight to get home, and then fight at work, and then fight to get to work, and then fight to get home, and then fight at work, and so on. So I'm saying thank you to you, and I hope that when my students see this, they understand that there are people like you out there who are in these seats, people like you that are in these seats, and people like these panelists who love them and care about them, like Ranking Member Raskin, who love them and care about them and want to see new things for our students. I do know that taking a public health approach would make gun violence a more central piece of the conversation, and that does matter. I am underwhelmed, though, because I'm afraid of America's ability to effectively solve the problem, even when it does raise it as a public health concern. Where has America shown its ability to solve these types of problems ever? I don't know. Maybe there's data that says yes to that, but I don't know. So my challenge is for us to, I suppose, take from some of those sort of ingredients that exist within us in terms of our resilience and our grit, our ability to figure things out, and take that same approach to this gun violence issue.
Thank you. And thank you for that. We have to show up, and those of us that have the experience, we need to, if we can, we bring that to the table. And so thank you for your work in this. And I do remember that it was really, really tough, but I remember thinking, as many bodies as I've seen in the street, as many times as a gun has been pointed at me, and as a survivor, being able to still be here after suffering at the hands of a very abusive partner who almost took my life with a gun. We shouldn't have to dig through our trauma, as Representative Ayanna Pressley says, to be able to help people. But for those of us that need to, we do that work. So thank you as well. I was going to close out with this. Last year, alongside my Democratic colleagues, even those who are in this room, we reintroduced the People's Response Act. This is a bill that establishes an inclusive, holistic, health-centered approach to public safety by creating a public health division within the United States Department of Health and Human Services, where it invests in violence interrupters and behavioral health personnel, trauma-informed care in both our schools and our communities. And so while our students and educators' communities, we know they shouldn't have to live like this. They shouldn't have to fear being murdered at their desk. But we know Republicans are walking around with assault rifle pens and still taking those donations, to fill their campaign coffers. Their fanatical obsession with guns is getting people killed. And so I just want to say, lastly, just to put on record, and we all know it, Democrats have introduced life-saving gun violence prevention solutions, just as Rep. Stansbury said. It's on the table. I've said it before and I'll say it again. How many more lives have to die? How many more people have to die before our GOP colleagues value our students' lives over their campaign contributions and over their time on television? Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Bush, thank you very much. Ms. Tlaib, thank you. Ms. Stansbury, thank you. I want to thank all the members who participated today. And I've got to thank our extraordinary witnesses, Frank DeAngelis and Patricia Greer, Gary Johnson, Melissa Alexander, Sarah Bird Sharps, Raquan Brown, and Dr. Joseph Sakran. Thank you all for joining us here. As Mr. Brown testified, gun violence culture is very deep in American history, and so we're going to need a very deep exploration of what gun violence actually means in the lives of the people, in terms of people's health, in terms of the public health, in terms of the economics of our society, and in terms of the quality of life and happiness. There's nothing in the Constitution that is stopping us from passing the common sense gun safety laws that we need. Nothing. Sometimes my colleagues say, Raskin wants us to repeal the Second Amendment. No, I don't want you to repeal the Second Amendment. I just want you to read the Second Amendment, okay? And it talks about a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, which is why the right to keep and bear arms is protected. But it's protected consistent with public safety and public health, and none other than Justice Scalia pointed that out in the Heller versus District of Columbia case about handgun safety. There's nothing in the Constitution stopping us from doing what we need to do to be saving thousands of American lives a year. And when these principles first came to talk to me, I was just ravaged by sorrow and sadness. But today, listening to all of them, I'm angry. I'm really mad that this is going on in the United States of America in 2024. And we're going to get through this. We're going to let these voices be heard. We're going to let people across the country testify as to what it really means to allow this level of gun violence to be taking place. And then we're going to make the changes that America needs. I want to thank everybody for coming. And with that, this hearing, this roundtable is adjourned.